It began like any other evening, quiet, in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the world itself had chosen to step back and leave this particular street untouched by urgency or noise. A narrow residential lane lined with modest houses, where lights flickered on one by one as dusk settled into night. And behind one of those softly glowing windows lived a family that, by all outward appearances, had nothing remarkable about them, nothing that would ever draw attention or suspicion, the kind of people neighbors greet politely but rarely think about twice, the kind of life that blends so seamlessly into routine that it almost becomes invisible, and yet it was inside this ordinary home that something began to unravel in a way no one could have predicted, not in the loud, chaotic sense often associated with violence, but in something quieter, something far more unsettling, a shift so subtle that it went unnoticed until it was far too late, because earlier that evening, at precisely 8:17 p.m., a phone call had been made from inside the house, a brief conversation that lasted less than a minute, the kind of call that would never raise alarms on its own, a voice on the other end confirming something, agreeing to something that would later become a fragment of a much larger puzzle, though at the time it passed like any other moment in an otherwise uneventful day. And as the hours moved forward, the house remained still, its curtains drawn, its doors locked, its occupants unaware that they were slowly becoming the center of a story that would soon spread far beyond their quiet street, because just after 10 p.m., a figure appeared at the edge of the property, not rushing, not hiding, but moving with a calm, almost rehearsed certainty. Someone who did not seem out of place and yet did not belong. Someone who approached the front door with a purpose that could not be mistaken for coincidence. And then, without hesitation, there was a knock, a simple, ordinary sound, the kind that echoes briefly and then disappears into the background, the kind that usually signals nothing more than a visitor, a neighbor, a delivery, something routine, something harmless. But on this night, that knock carried something else, something heavier, something that would later be described not in terms of sound, but in terms of consequence. Because inside the house there was a pause, a moment where movement stopped, where attention shifted, where someone made the decision to answer, a decision that in any other context would mean nothing at all. And yet here it became the point from which everything else would follow. And what happened in the minutes after that door opened is something no one witnessed directly. No cameras captured it. No neighbors heard anything unusual. No immediate signs suggested that anything was wrong, which in itself became one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case. Because when something so devastating occurs without noise, without struggle, without interruption, it raises a question that is far more unsettling than any evidence could answer. How does something like that happen in silence? How does it unfold so completely without leaving behind the kind of chaos we expect? And as the night deepened, the house returned to stillness, the same stillness it had before, but now it was different. Now it carried a weight that could not be seen from the outside, a quiet that was no longer peaceful but absolute, and it was not until the following morning when the routine of the neighborhood resumed, and the absence of movement inside that house began to feel unusual, that the first signs of concern appeared. A neighbor, noticing that the front door was not fully closed, just slightly ajar, something so small it could easily be dismissed, and yet something about it felt wrong, enough to prompt a closer look, enough to break the invisible boundary that usually keeps people from interfering in each other's lives. And when that boundary was crossed, when the door was pushed open just enough to reveal what lay beyond, the reality of what had happened inside that house began to take shape, not all at once, not in a single shocking moment, but in fragments, in details that did not belong together, and yet formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. A silence that was too complete, a stillness that was too final, and as authorities were called and the scene began to be examined, the initial assumption was that this was not random, not chaotic, but something deliberate, something controlled, something that had unfolded with a precision that suggested planning rather than impulse, and that realization shifted everything, because it meant that the knock on the door had not been an accident, not a coincidence, but a beginning, a carefully chosen moment that marked the start of something that would leave behind more questions than answers. And among those questions, one stood out more than the rest. Who was at the door, and why did they choose this house, this family, this night? And as investigators began to piece together the timeline, to trace back the hours leading up to that moment, they found small details that seemed insignificant on their own, but grew heavier when viewed together. The brief phone call, the lack of forced entry, the absence of disturbance, all pointing toward a possibility that was far more unsettling than a stranger forcing their way inside. The possibility that whoever knocked was expected, or at the very least, not feared. And that single idea began to reshape the narrative entirely, turning what initially appeared to be a mystery into something far more personal, something that suggested familiarity, trust, and ultimately betrayal. Because the most chilling aspect of all was not how the night ended, but how it began, with something as simple and ordinary as a knock, a sound that exists in every part of life, a signal of arrival, of presence, of connection, and yet here it became something else entirely, something that marked the boundary between normalcy and something far darker, a moment that once crossed could never be undone. And as the investigation continued, as the story slowly unfolded, it became clear that this was not just about what happened inside that house, but about everything that led up to it, every decision, every interaction, every unnoticed detail that quietly aligned to create a night that would never be forgotten, a night that began with a knock and ended with silence, leaving behind a question that would echo long after the case itself moved forward, whether the danger had truly arrived from outside, or whether it had been waiting much closer all along, hidden within the ordinary rhythms of a life that seemed safe until the moment it wasn't, until the moment a simple knock became the last sound they would ever choose to answer, a moment that would later be revisited again and again by those trying to understand it, replayed in different ways, imagined with different outcomes, as if somewhere within that single decision there had been an opportunity to change everything, to stop what followed before it began. But the reality remained unchanged, fixed in time, unmoved by speculation or regret, because once that door had opened, whatever had been set in motion continued without interruption, without hesitation, unfolding in a way that left behind no immediate trace of struggle, no loud disruption to signal that something was wrong, only the quiet transition from normalcy to something final, something irreversible. And it is perhaps that absence of visible conflict that makes the story linger, that makes it harder to process, because it suggests that the most devastating moments are not always marked by chaos, but by silence, by the absence of resistance, by a sequence of events that move forward with a certainty that feels almost unnatural. And as investigators would later discover, that certainty did not begin at the door. It began long before, in conversations that seemed ordinary at the time, in choices that carried no visible weight, in interactions that blended into the background of everyday life, until all of them converged into a single night, a single moment, a single knock, and from that point forward, everything that followed was no longer preventable, only inevitable, leaving behind a story that would not be remembered for its noise or its spectacle, but for its quiet, for the way it unfolded without warning, for the way it transformed something familiar into something unrecognizable, and for the way it left behind a silence that said more than any sound ever could. By the time investigators fully stepped into the house, the silence that had first seemed ordinary began to feel constructed, almost intentional, as though whatever had happened inside had not only ended lives but erased the natural disorder that usually follows violence. And this absence became the first real clue. Not something visible, but something deeply wrong in its restraint, because rooms that should have shown signs of panic instead appeared paused in time, objects left where they belonged, furniture undisturbed, no clear indication of struggle, and yet the atmosphere carried a weight that that could not be explained by what was seen alone, a quiet pressure that seemed to linger in the air itself, pressing against every surface, every corner, every unanswered question. And as forensic teams moved carefully from one space to another, documenting, observing, collecting, they began to realize that this was not a scene of chaos, but one of control. A sequence that had unfolded with such precision that it almost defied the expectations of violence. And this precision forced them to reconsider their earliest assumptions, because if there had been no forced entry, no visible confrontation, no signs of immediate resistance, then the person who had entered that house had either been trusted or had created a situation where trust was no longer questioned, and that distinction would become critical because it shifted the investigation away from randomness and toward intention, away from opportunity and toward design. And as they began reconstructing the timeline, minute by minute, detail by detail, they returned again to the phone call made earlier that evening, the one that had seemed so insignificant at first. A short exchange that now carried a different weight, because records confirmed that it had been placed to a number not frequently contacted, a number that did not belong to close family or known friends, but to someone whose connection to the household was not immediately clear. And when investigators traced that number further, what they found did not provide answers, but instead opened a new line of uncertainty, because it led to a device that had been inactive for long periods, used sporadically, almost cautiously, as if it existed only when needed and disappeared when not. And that pattern suggested something deliberate, something that hinted at planning far beyond a spontaneous act. And as this thread began to develop, another detail emerged, one that had initially gone unnoticed, a neighbor recalling that earlier in the evening, before the knock, there had been a car parked briefly near the end of the street, not long enough to attract suspicion, not unusual enough to be remembered clearly, but present just long enough to matter. And this small recollection added another layer to the unfolding narrative, because it suggested that the arrival at the house had not been immediate, that there had been a pause, a moment of observation, or perhaps hesitation before the final approach, and that moment, however brief, hinted at something internal, something human, something that existed between decision and action. And as investigators continued to gather these fragments, they began to notice something else, something that did not fit with the idea of a stranger, small indications within the house that pointed toward familiarity, subtle details that suggested the person inside had not been entirely unwelcome, at least not at first. And this realization began to reshape the emotional core of the case, because it introduced the possibility that the boundary between victim and perpetrator had not been defined by distance, but by proximity, by a relationship that had existed before that night. And this possibility became even more pronounced when digital records were analyzed, messages exchanged in the days leading up to the incident, conversations that, on the surface, appeared normal, but when read in sequence revealed a shift in tone, a gradual movement from casual interaction to something more strained, something that carried an undercurrent of tension that had gone unnoticed at the time. And within those messages, there were moments that now stood out with unsettling clarity, questions that had not been fully answered, statements that seemed incomplete, and a subtle but undeniable sense that something had been building beneath the surface long before the knock at the door. And as investigators followed this line further, they encountered resistance, gaps in information, missing context, and inconsistencies that made it difficult to form a complete picture. And yet these gaps were not random. They seemed selective, as though certain pieces had been removed while others were left behind. And this selective absence became a clue in itself, because it suggested awareness, an understanding of what needed to be hidden and what could remain. And that level of awareness pointed towards someone who was not only familiar with the house, but with the people inside it, someone who understood routines, habits, vulnerabilities, and most importantly, trust. And as this profile began to take shape, the investigation reached a point where the question was no longer simply who had done this, but how long it had been in motion, how far back the origins of that night could be traced. Because the more they uncovered, the more it became clear that this was not a single moment of violence, but the culmination of something that had been developing quietly, gradually, almost invisibly, until it reached a point where it could no longer be contained, and that realization brought with it a deeper unease, because it meant that the signs had likely been there, scattered across days, weeks, perhaps even months, hidden within ordinary interactions, overlooked conversations, subtle changes that did not seem significant at the time. And as investigators attempted to piece together those signs, to reconstruct not just the events of that night, but the context that surrounded it, they found themselves facing a narrative that refused to settle into something simple or predictable, a story that shifted depending on where they looked, revealing different possibilities, different interpretations, none of which fully explained the whole. And this complexity became one of the defining features of the case, because it prevented closure, it resisted certainty, and instead left behind a trail of questions that seemed to multiply the closer they were examined. And among those questions, one continued to surface with increasing urgency. What changed? What transformed whatever connection existed into something capable of ending in silence? And as the investigation moved forward, as more data was analyzed, more interviews conducted, more details uncovered, the answer to that question remained just out of reach, obscured by contradictions and incomplete information, and yet there was a growing sense that the truth was not hidden in a single piece of evidence, but in the pattern formed by all of them together, a pattern that suggested not chaos, but intention, not randomness, but design. And as that pattern slowly began to emerge, it pointed toward a conclusion that was as unsettling as it was difficult to accept, that the knock on the door had not been the beginning of the story, but the final step in a sequence that had already been set in motion long before that night, a sequence that had unfolded quietly, deliberately, and without interruption, until it reached a point where silence was the only possible outcome. And in that silence, the truth remained, waiting to be uncovered, piece by piece, question by question, until nothing was left but the reality of what had been done, and the understanding that whatever had happened inside that house was not just an act of violence, but the end of something that had been breaking long before anyone realized it. What finally began to emerge in the days that followed was not a single revelation, not a sudden breakthrough that neatly explained everything, but something slower, heavier, a realization that formed gradually as separate threads began to converge, aligning in a way that felt less like discovery and more like inevitability, because the deeper investigators went, the clearer it became that the answer had never been entirely hidden. It had simply been buried beneath layers of familiarity, routine, and assumption. And when those layers were stripped away, what remained was not a stranger in the shadows, not an unknown figure slipping in and out of darkness, but someone whose presence had already existed within the boundaries of that home, someone who had stood on that doorstep before, someone whose knock would not have triggered fear but recognition. And that realization changed everything, because it reframed the entire night, transforming it from an intrusion into something far more personal, something that carried with it the weight of trust broken in the most irreversible way. And as this understanding took hold, attention turned back to the fragments that had once seemed disconnected. The phone call, the messages, the brief appearance of a car, all of them now fitting into a pattern that no longer felt abstract but deliberate, each piece pointing toward a relationship that had deteriorated quietly, without spectacle, until it reached a point where resolution no longer came through conversation, but through something final, something that could not be undone. And within that pattern, one detail began to stand out with increasing clarity, a series of interactions in the days leading up to the incident that suggested urgency, a shift in tone that moved beyond tension into something closer to desperation, as though something had been demanded, something had been refused. And whatever existed between those 2 points had created a fracture that could not be repaired. And while the exact nature of that fracture remained unclear, its presence was undeniable, woven into every exchange, every silence, every moment that now carried a different meaning when viewed in hindsight. And as investigators continued to build their case, to follow the direction these clues were pointing, they encountered the kind of resistance that often accompanies uncomfortable truths, contradictions in statements, gaps in recollection, subtle inconsistencies that, on their own, might be dismissed, but together formed a pattern that could not be ignored, a pattern that suggested not confusion, but concealment. And that distinction became critical because it marked the difference between uncertainty and intention, between not knowing and choosing not to reveal. And as this line of inquiry deepened, it led to a point where the narrative could no longer sustain ambiguity, where the pieces aligned in a way that demanded acknowledgement, even if that acknowledgement carried consequences that extended far beyond the immediate case. Because what it revealed was not just the identity of the person who had been at the door, but the nature of their connection to the people inside, a connection rooted in familiarity, shaped by history, and ultimately defined by a moment in which that history collapsed into something irreversible. And while the details of that moment remained partially obscured, shielded by the very silence that had defined the scene from the beginning, its outcome was undeniable, its impact absolute. And as legal proceedings began to take form, as evidence was presented and arguments constructed, the case moved from investigation into judgment, a transition that brought with it a different kind of tension, one that shifted the focus from what happened to how it would be understood, how it would be remembered, and whether the truth, in all its complexity, could ever be fully captured within the structure of a courtroom. And for those connected to the victims, for those who had known them not as names in a report but as people in a shared life, that question carried a weight that could not be resolved through verdicts or sentences, because what had been lost was not just presence, but continuity, a future that would never unfold, moments that would never happen. And in the absence of those things, there remained only the attempt to make sense of something that resisted simple explanation. And as time moved forward, as the immediate intensity of the case began to settle into something more distant, more reflective, the house itself became something else, no longer just a place where people had lived, but a space defined by what had happened within it, a silent structure holding the imprint of a night that had changed everything. And for the neighborhood, for those who passed by it, who remembered what it once represented, that transformation served as a constant reminder that the boundary between normalcy and tragedy is often thinner than it appears, that the most devastating events do not always announce themselves with warning, but arrive quietly, disguised within the ordinary, until it is too late to recognize them for what they are. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all, not the specifics of what occurred, not the identity of the person responsible, but the realization that nothing about that night, at least on the surface, seemed extraordinary, that it began with something as simple as a knock, a sound so common it rarely invites suspicion. And yet within that simplicity existed the potential for something far more profound, a moment that would divide everything into before and after, into what was and what could never be again. And as the story comes to an end, as the details settle into memory and the questions that remain begin to fade into something quieter, something less immediate but no less significant, there is still one image that refuses to disappear, one moment that continues to echo long after everything else has been said. The sound of that knock, not loud, not violent, not urgent, but steady, deliberate, final, a sound that carried with it a decision, a choice, a turning point that once crossed could never be reversed. And in that sense, the night did not end with silence. It began with it. A silence that existed in the space between the knock and the door opening. A silence that held within it everything that was about to happen. Everything that could have been different. Everything that was already too late. And maybe that is what makes this story linger. What gives it a presence that does not fade easily. The understanding that sometimes the most important moments are the quietest ones, the ones that pass without recognition until they are all that remain. And somewhere in the memory of that house, in the stillness that followed, that moment continues to exist, unchanged, waiting, a reminder that not every warning comes as a shout. Sometimes it comes as a knock, and sometimes that is enough.